Jai Hind and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. China has been the flavor of the season for a little bit with all the protests and all everything else that is happening there after re-anointment of Xi Jinping, if I may. Uh, we need to understand how has China changed. One question we always look at is how are we looking at China, but rarely are we speaking about how is China looking at us. To discuss this, I have with me Lieutenant General PJS Pannu for the first time on Dev Talks, someone who served across China, someone who was the Deputy Chief of the Integrated Defense Staff. Sir, thank you so much, firstly, for joining me. And I've been reading a lot about what you write about China, and I've heard a couple of places where you've spoken about it. Uh, your perspective is interesting, and that's one of the reasons I thought we could kind of get together and talk about it. So, firstly, welcome to the show, sir, and looking forward to hearing what you have to tell us.
Thank you, Adi, for getting me to your Dev Talks event. China interests everybody. Uh, if not strategically, at least people have commercial interests in China, and somebody who doesn't have any interest in China at least knows that everybody else has interest about China, so they also incidentally get involved with China. So I think it is a flavor for every person, all age groups, all kind of uh, people in the society. I think it's an interesting topic to discuss.
Sir, the first question I want to ask you is, uh, a lot of the naysayers, if I may, would say that China does not consider India as a threat. I want to ask you is one, how does China look at India on a bilateral basis, and of course, how does China look at India in the neighborhoods perspective, sir?
China's outlook has been how they perceive the world, and I think they have been constantly trying to live that dream of being the Middle Kingdom. And as far as the Indian subcontinent is concerned, that Mao's five fingers pointing towards India and the periphery of India have been very concerning. The claims towards India and Indian neighborhood directly across Tibet and the string of pearls that generally everybody has been talking around over 2 decades or 3 decades has also been a source of concern. Now, why does China do this? Is because India has a very important, significant location, which is geostrategic from the Chinese perspective. We sit on the Indian Ocean. We have Himalayan frontier, which has been acting as our defender uh, because of the terrain difficulties to come across. Um, and as a result, Indian subcontinent had largely got a natural protection as a barrier against China or anybody north of Himalayas. Uh, India can sit on opportunities if India wants to because of the openness that it has and the connectivity that it has with the world. Because it being a seafaring nation, also the lines of communication largely across the world pass through the Indian Ocean,
Hmm.
which makes India as a source of trouble in case India grows uh, into a position of domination. So, therefore, China constantly keeps looking at India not to allow it to come to a place where it can dominate China, at least through the oceans, and not use Himalayan frontier as a guard against troubling and coordinating their geostrategic alliances with anybody else in the world, which is now at play more clearly. So I suppose China is wary of India because it has potential to compete and it has potential to grow, maybe to a point which will threaten the ultimate dream of China to grow. I suppose that is only how China looks at India. However, China has never looked at India uh, on priority. Their priority has always been United States and Japan. In fact, one of the defense ministers, former defense ministers, told me when he visited China that he asked the Chinese that what is your priority. So they said priority is that we have to compete and we have to defeat America first, and then we have to do the same to Japan. And they never spoke about India. So the minister was constrained to ask them, "What do you think of India?" So they said, "We don't think of India at the moment." So they put India on the back burner at that time. Now I'm talking about something about 2 decades back. But I think time has come where India has come into their priority as well.
That is an interesting perspective, because considering the factor that the if you say the growth chart of India, post 2010 kind of started going the right direction, and that's when you see the Chinese pressure kind of coming in regularly towards India. So that kind of connects the dots. But you know, the geopolitical situation of the world today will, of course, warrant a change in perspective for every country to look at its bilateral and multilateral relations, and that we see happening with all these multilateral forums in G20 and BRICS and whole lot of things which are taking place. But with the changing world order today, sir, how do you look at India China going forward? Because for the Chinese to kind of break the domination, the financial domination of the US, if India is on their side, it's easier. If it's not, there's a problem. There's a huge problem for that matter. So, how do you see this perspective going forward?
As I said, that China basically looked at um, America as a main challenge, and many assessments had predicted that China would overtake the American economically, militarily, in about next 2 to 3 decades.
Mm.
Uh, Obviously, these assessments are based on certain factors, but there are certain events which can actually change all those assessments, and those uh, assessments can be seen that in at least last 2 decades, the world has got concerned with the rise of China.
Hmm.
But before that, the world largely has been pushing China against the Russian threat. Uh, the great game was basically to bring China as a buffer, not
Balancing.
to have the Russian expansion southwards. So therefore, they kept propping up China to a point that it became a threat. So in last 2 decades, they see that the China, which was initially having a policy of grow peacefully and bide time, and hide your strength. I think now the time has come that it has shunned that strategy. Maybe there are internal weaknesses coming up in China where now it is actually hiding weaknesses and trying to show strength. So I think somewhere the strategy of hiding the strength has also gone into hiding certain weaknesses, because there are a lot of internal stabilities, and the tall leaders like Xi Jinping make sure that their personalities overshadow the national personality. So I think Xi Jinping's personality has started overshadowing the Chinese, overall persona.
Perspective. Hmm.
These tall leaders then make promises, or their tall leaders get some people around them who make them believe that they are the best and they can do the best for the country. And I think they land up taking decisions which have taken China to the point that it is now being seen as a global threat.
Uh, the I mean, the whole parody, the whole, the whole flip side of the situation is that the world built up China to go against Russia, and we see them getting pushed together. So it's the same world is doing that today. So that's a big, contradiction of sorts. But so one thing that you mentioned, which is interesting to me, is that the India factor again in this entire game. Would you call the Chinese intervention into India, whatever they try to do at that time, as a strategic mistake on their part, or would you take it as something that they needed to do to kind of set up their hegemony in that area, in this region? Take out the biggest dog available so that you can kind of stand and say, "Listen, I do this, so just stay away from me."
I think Chinese are working on a narrative which they wrote long time back, even
Hmm.
in 50s. Mao Zedong, uh, considering Tibet as a palm and those five fingers that I was referring to earlier. So they have not given up that strategy. It is just that they were not strong enough economically. Their internal problems were there. I think over a period of time, they have tried to manage themselves internally, where politically they have become more reformed in a manner that the powers that are there now have become absolute powers.
Hmm.
And when you have absolute powers, those decisions can be taken to realize a dream quicker than naturally otherwise it would have unfolded. The kind of military modernization the naval expansion, and the kind of air power that they have built, which was a weakness earlier, maybe about 2 decades back. Today, the PLA Navy is actually, if you see only counting the marbles and number of platforms that they have, are more than the US Navy, which is supposed to be a global naval power. So they have not only matched, but I think maybe they don't have the experience, but they have the numbers. Similarly, we have been talking about that the PLA Air Force has not been very strong, and we say their capability to operate from Tibet has not been very good. So, Indian Air Force is much better um, as far as air power is concerned and air domination is concerned. But I think their technology, their production of military hardware has also brought the Air Force, if not at par, but at least quite competent to defend or, I suppose, have air dominance superiority in Tibet. Time will only tell, and largely their hardware has not been tested. So, my only fear is that once you build a military industrial complex to a point and you don't test it, uh, there has been a strategy pushed by the defense industry that you must have a testing ground. I hope India is not one where they land up testing some of their hardware. I think that is one source of concern that I have in my mind.
So you basically link the MIC of the US to MIC of the China, which is an interesting connection. And so, how do you look at one interesting perspective that you put out is with regards to the capability? They've got the numbers, they've got the size, they've got the showcase technology, if I may, and that's what they do quite a bit with regards to their little teasers and that all that stuff comes out. I think the latest one was these female PLA soldiers, tank crew basically doing some exercises in Xinjiang, and complete snowed out areas and stuff like this. Of course, it's a strategic message that they're trying to send that we can operate in these kind of environments. What is your input on the Chinese belief? Because there have been talks about the capability within China. Xi Jinping talks about the military capability. I mean, I think 15 times a year. The PLA daily has come out and said we are not ready for all-out offensives and a lot of operations. How do you kind of perceive how the Chinese look at their own capability? We have our assessments, sir,
Uh,
but the Chinese
Adi,
perspective.
we are living in the era of information dominance and information warfare, psychological warfare. I think we are also looking at how the nations are trying to build their own image through perspectives by throwing out demonstrator medias to people to scare them, which also becomes a testing ground.
Yeah.
The only place where metal meets metal or a soldier meets soldier becomes the ultimate testing ground, and it has happened in 2020 on the birthday of Xi Jinping on 15th of June. That Galwan was one place where the soldiers actually, instead of rubbing shoulders, I think they landed up thrashing each other, and uh, the jury is still out. While, of course, there are figures that the Chinese have suffered much more casualty. Once you taste that, then you go back to revising your own strategies to understand that should we go for a physical fight or now should we change ourselves into a modern way of war fighting. But the point is that the Chinese are very good at reinventing themselves. They would have created a database onto how the Indian army operates and how the Indian army's uh, leaders, military and political leaders think. So as a result, they would also go back to the redesigning of the chessboard with this data available to them. In fact, after Galwan, whatever the action was taken by the Indians through their little diplomatic and little military maneuver, they have been able to release some of the pressure on themselves. Ultimately, today they are sitting in certain areas which are only to a disadvantage of India, but of to no disadvantage to the Chinese. So really speaking, where if they have reinvented their tactical to operational maneuver and art of warfare and political maneuvering, I think they have been able to achieve something temporarily. But I think the strategic game is still at play. The military strength is still there. They're maintaining over four divisions of strength in that area. More troops come in for exercise, which is always the case that when you build up, you say they are for exercise, but then they come with ammunition. They have built huge amount of arsenal, which has the underground capability of over 2 months of logistic sustenance that they have built in the underground facilities itself. They have expanded their length of the runways. They have made helidromes. They have built a lot of infrastructure between 2020 and now. So as a result, you see them very clearly preparing for a military option and also demonstrating it at the same time. But yet, the military resolve will only be displayed once we again go back to any combat action. So I suppose one of their strategies is to win war without fighting one.
Hmm.
So they would continue to do that, keep bluffing us around. More you meet a Chinese leader, more threat becomes, I mean, going back to Mao Zedong, um, Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai and Panchsheel Agreement. Actually,
Oh.
what did it lead us to? 1962 war.
Hmm.
So more you extend hands of friendship, they take it as weakness. So really speaking, with Chinese, you have to have a strong friendship in the sense that you have to have a friendship where you are actually putting out your strengths in front of them rather than a soft approach to friendship. So don't relent. Uh, Display your might and strength and be firm with them. They might just respect you. And I suppose that is what it works. And I think today we have two tall leaders, both sides. They have similar policies. Both are big reformists. Both have aggressive foreign policies. Both understand the power of the military. I think that was never the case earlier. So I think the intent of the two leaders and the systems, of course, are not the same. But I think largely the behavior of the two leaders is quite similar. That so the strength is going to be matched strength as far as overall the political resolve is concerned. The political resolve will always be followed by the military and the diplomatic resolve.
I think that's a very, very. I've not heard this before. That there is a there's a comparative, and that I think it's very rightly put that you're saying both are strong, both want what something for their own country, and they both have got a certain perspective which they're pushing across the world. With what strength and this and that is all a different discussion altogether. But so the interesting part again is the G20, where I want to take you back to. Uh, India becoming the president of G20, and the India also becoming the president of the BRICS. You're also going to be sitting on the Security Council, UNSC president seat. So there's a whole lot in terms of multilateral forums which India is going to come to. We saw a brief interaction. The jury is still out who walked up to whom. Some say Modi Saab walked up to him. Some say it was just natural. They were crossing paths and they just decided to kind of do whatever they needed to do. Uh, in India, we don't pick up on these things, but the Chinese analyze these little things very, very carefully, sir. Uh, there are certain writings about it within China, but far and few between. How would you analyze the Chinese trying to shift a little bit of their aggressive behavior to a little bit of a sideline because they want to, at the end of it, use India for their own benefit?
Uh, Giving the reference point of G20, I would take you back 2 months before that the two leaders had already also met
SEO.
at the platform of SEO. The body language then and body
That's
language
bold.
2 months later was very different. In fact, the opposite. So we have to also discuss what happened at Samarkand and why the behavior was what it was.
Yeah.
Was it that he was showing his anger, or was he uncomfortable back at home as to whether he would get the extension or the third term or not? Because I think there was a lot of opposition to the next event, uh, how his next term is going to be looked at internally. I think he had to quickly rush back and possibly arrested a few people, uh, controlled the political narrative in a manner that he not only had earlier declared himself as president for life, but he has proven that now this third term would also mean that he is going to remain the president of life. And he's pretty young from that perspective. He's just about 69. And giving the natural age, maybe he would be there relevant for another, if not 20, but at least 15 years.
10, 15 years.
And that is a very long term. So now that he's more comfortable in his own skin, and this is what changed maybe between Samarkand and G20, that the party congress itself gave him that assurance that now you can be more comfortable, you are secure at home. Also, the president Xi Jinping would have also looked at the Prime Minister Modi, that now he's a leader of the group. That why would he not be cozy to a person who's being crowned as a leader? I'm just using a loose terminology of crowned as a leader, but
No, no,
when
no. Yeah.
you are symbolically saying that he is the one who's in this particular group the most relevant person, so why would he not shake hands with him? Uh, and also from the Prime Minister Modi side, when he knew that he's going to take the leadership of the group, why would he also not want to shake hands with every person that who came in that group? So I think so. The status of Modi and status of Xi Jinping both had undergone a huge change in these
Hmm.
2 months, and I suppose that is what was at display at G20.
Interesting. As I said, the Chinese would want to use India. I mean, I'm an Indian. I hope they don't try and do that. But at the end of it, they would want to use India for their own benefit. And to shun a leader today of multilateral forums, which you have driven yourself, like the SU and BRICS, is not a very wise decision. So that's what it is. So, but when you go forward and you see Xi Jinping now kind of facing a little more backlash within China, that tells you that the opposition that he tried to stamp out is not gone completely. Um, I won't want to get into Jiang faction and this faction and that faction altogether, but that tells you that the internal strength that you just mentioned might not be fully materialized. There is a certain sense of opposition to the Chinese president or Chinese leader, Xi Jinping. How do you see that festering in the future? Because I personally, and I've said this on this platform before with many people I've discussed the Chinese protest with, I personally thought it was a weekend protest and probably extend a couple of days here and there in the places where there's maximum issues. But today we see, in spite of the fact that the Chinese have opened up a little bit, we still see a lot of opposition. We still see these videos coming out, and these are, I mean, people are now putting date stamps on these videos. So they want to communicate to the rest of the world that this is happening now. It's not an old video being circulated. So that's very interesting of the Chinese opposition, the people that are trying to do this. How do you see Xi Jinping's international outlook going forward, looking at all this which is happening in this country?
Actually, many thoughts cross my mind as you speak about the COVID restrictions. One which is not usually spoken about is that to have a lockdown is like putting a curfew, and you actually resort to putting a curfew when there is a law and order problem,
Yeah.
and you want to control your own population. So it may not be so much to do with COVID, but largely to make sure that you control the population and you can actually put anybody under house arrest under the garb of a lockdown. Uh, so the 20th Party Congress making him a strong leader or appear to be a strong leader also gives him absolute control over people. And run up to his third presidency, I think he also needed to control people. Uh, so on one side, maybe their strict COVID norms also give you a reasoning that their vaccination, as they were touting, has also failed. Their programs failed, and it was not very effective, and people still continue to fall sick. That is again not a very good commentary on their health system. Their ICUs are not there at all available to them. They have hospitals, but the number of ICUs are very, very few. The number of people who've lost their life, not because of COVID, because of other diseases, is hugely because they could not even go and get themselves treated, for cancer or for heart or for other ailments. So as a result, there is a very large anger which is there among people that this COVID policy or lockdowns have not only brought the economy down, there is a mismatch in the domestic demand. uh, there is also no production happening because the units also went,
Long.
literally to the lowest functioning. There's no production happening. So as a result, there were no exports. largely the world has also started moving away from the Chinese imports. So there is no international demand, there is no domestic demand. There is no money in the pockets of people to even generate a demand. So as a result, I think there is a lot of internal weakness which Xi Jinping wants to cover through control and absolute control. And I think that is one big sense of trouble which I get, that when the economy is down and people are against you, he will impose more controls over them with absolute power. He might even resort to a diversion of attention, which could mean that create an external emergency to make sure that internally, if people are out of control, at least under the external emergency situation, he would be able to control his own population and divert the attention of people and make them more nationalists. If you don't make them nationalists, they will actually start questioning your internal authority. And I think many leaders in the past have also done this. So I think it's time to watch, time to be very careful as neighbors of China, that their trouble could mean that the trouble could spin out very differently outwardly.
I think, so I was smiling right through your answer because that's what I firmly believe. I refuse to believe anything else because uh, at the end of it, I don't know if you following the protests closely, but there's a thing that will yellow you. So that's the threat that the police guys give to the people protesting. We'll yellow you. What does that mean is you can't go home, you can't go out. So people literally pitch their tents in the middle of the road and they're sleeping because they're not allowed to go anywhere. So that's the kind of stuff, and that's what gave me the thought about what you're trying to say, and that's very interesting. So my last question, and I want to ask you this question as a teaser to probably a next talk I would request you to have with me, with regards to when we see China today. We see the reanointment of Xi Jinping, we see uh, the controls that he's trying to do, we see his economy kind of stuttering, we see certain aspects of his economy close to about 7 or 8 trillion dollars kind of being on the brink right now. And that's something that I'm not saying that's what the Chinese are saying. The SCMP talks about it, the DW talks about it to a certain extent, but in a very hidden way. uh, how do you see us looking at interpreting the Chinese situation? Because the change in China would also need us to kind of modify our approach. You mentioned one thing, to be watch out for a military sort of a game in on the border. What else, sir?
As far as Chinese are concerned, they are watching the globe very closely. They are actually looking at the Russian experience of invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah.
Um, they're also looking at how the same theory would apply if they undertake an offensive. And as a result, they would not dirty their hands or get stuck into a situation where um, they are seen to be running failed expeditions, such as how the Russians failed in Afghanistan. They were made to fail in Afghanistan. The Russians are also now, that was a proxy war situation where the Americans armed the Mujahideens with all kind of weapons and the missiles. Same thing is happening to Ukraine, where again proxy war is at play. uh, so if the Chinese are looking at any expansion, so the Americans would come there and make it a proxy war against China. I hope it is not India, but India being a strong country, it's a subcontinent, may not really happen here, but it can certainly happen towards Taiwan side.
Taiwan.
So Chinese are watching this very, very carefully. So internally, if there is a problem, I suppose if Xi Jinping is wise, he has to secure his third term, at least to make certain amends where he was possibly going too fast. He might just slow down a bit, trying to mend his ways internally, and again come up to a place where the Russian Ukraine, or the overall global instability would stabilize to a point of understanding of people. The world must get more stable before the Chinese act next, and this is how I suppose the Chinese would do. They would have a strategic pause in the behavior,
Hmm.
watch the unstable world stabilize. The economy not only in China is tumbling, but all over there's a recession which is setting in. um, I suppose they would wait and watch before they take the next action, which would be in their favor or against them is a matter of how it unfolds. But I suppose it is time for them to have a relook internally and externally. Any hasty step by Chinese is only going against them, and the world is waiting for that opportunity. They're waiting for the fly to take off, and they would swatter it down. So I suppose Xi Jinping would understand it.
I think Xi Jinping, if he's listening to this show, one thing that he should take away, which you hinted to, is the goodwill. The Russians still do have a lot of goodwill with the Chinese don't. So that's
Yeah,
you kind of hinted towards it,
absolutely.
and I wanted to put this across. But if he's watching this show, I'd like to tell him, please, you don't have the goodwill that you would be able
Yeah,
to. And of course,
absolutely.
there's a lot that will go behind what they're trying to do. Sir, thank you so much. This has been I think, a very good show, and I hope it's an introductory show to a lot many more interactions between yourself and me. And a Chinese perspective that you've put across is a perspective of nervousness, is a perspective of introspection at the moment, and but it's also a perspective of aggression to cover up that nervousness and the internal turmoil that is happening within China. And that, I think, as you very rightly said, it's a dangerous time for not just India but the rest of the world, because they are unpredictable in terms of how this whole thing would kind of come across. But sir, thank you so much. As I said, this has been a brilliant talk, and I look forward to hearing from you, and of course, reading from you as well with regards to what's happening. And I think it's a geopolitically active world, so it'll give us a lot many more opportunities to do some more analysis. Till next time, sir. Jai Hind.
Thank you, Adi. In fact, before I leave, I would say that today we have reached a stage where, in the global arena, there will be more number of people who would be clapping to see or jubilating if the dragon collapses. I think there will
Oh,
be no more number of people who are waiting for this to happen. I think Xi Jinping would understand it, and this is squarely coming from your goodwill part. Thank you, Adi. It
thank you, sir.
was very nice interacting with you.
Thank you, sir. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too. Thank you. Bye.